Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum and welcome to another edition of Debunked here on INX Prime. My name is Sulaimaan Ravat. Madlanga Commission, my word, I don't think you will find a South African in a hurry who hasn't heard at least the term. And most South Africans are reading and hearing and talking about it on a very regular basis. Now, what happens in an instance like this, you hear about a story today, one aspect, you see a clip, something sensational, the evidence leaders managed to corner a witness, something dramatic was revealed, and there's all sorts of clips doing the rounds and memes and social media commentary and the like. But as things progress over a prolonged period of time, you can sometimes lose perspective in terms of the overall picture and what has transpired to date and where we stand with the Madlanga Commission of Inquiry, how it all started and where it's likely to go and what's realistic to expect. So in that context, we are focusing on the Madlanga Commission of Inquiry today here on the program, and our guest is Dr. Dale McKinley. A very good day to you, sir, and welcome to the program. Really appreciate your time.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you, Sulaimaan. Thank you for having me.
If we start with that point that I just mentioned in my introduction, where do we stand currently in terms of the Madlanga Commission of Inquiry in a broad sense, in terms of why it was initiated, where it started, extensions and the like, and how much we've progressed?
Yeah, so just as a quick sort of history, a reminder, this commission was established by the president in order to respond to the allegations that were made by Lieutenant General Mkhwanazi quite some time back, related to particularly the SAPS, the South African Police Services, and the corruption and the allegations that he made about it being captured by criminal syndicates. Once this commission started, obviously most of the initial testimony and initial investigations were centered around particular police individuals and high-ranking SAPS officials. But that has now sort of expanded beyond the SAPS to take in obviously the prosecutorial authorities, the National Prosecuting Authority, IDAC, which is the Independent Directorate, Investigative Directorate, and also I think it is also taken into consideration sort of more junior officials or subordinate SAPS officials like in Ekurhuleni and in some of the metros that have been involved. So it's now, but the SAPS is the focus, but it is really looking at the mismanagement and corruption and the relationships that developed over a long period of time in relation to both our prosecutorial as well as our security authorities.
So some prominent names, or some names have become, maybe not prominent, but perhaps even infamous as things have progressed. So you had Salim Karim, then you had General Feroz Khan, and now Andrea Johnson. How do we ensure that as ordinary South Africans who've got day jobs, who've got to deal with traffic and carpool and everything else, that we have the proper context of what's happening within the Madlanga Commission of Inquiry, and we don't get carried away with what perhaps could be described as the sensational element of it, and that which sometimes features in the reportage around, such proceedings?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, the short answer to that is to pay attention to the serious journalists and serious coverage. As you say, there's a lot of noise on social media. There's a lot of claims, misinformation, sensationalism. But if you look at some of the coverage that has been done by good investigative journalists, whether that's through outfits like the Daily Maverick, Amabungani, Ground Up, also with some of the community radio stations that have been following things, I think that citizens will get a good picture. I know it's difficult to sort of separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, but in this case, I think what they have done is there's a lot of good summaries that have been presented in relation to some of this testimony, because it's impossible. Remember, there was also a parliamentary inquiry that took place in relation to a parallel to the Madlanga Commission, and that came up with a whole nother range of testimonies and allegations and claims. So yeah, it's a bit of a mess in the sense of the information that's out there. But I think if one pays attention to the Madlanga Commission itself and what it's saying, and also to what's coming out of it practically, as opposed to the claims, In other words, who's getting arrested, who's getting charged, or at least who are the people that are getting fingered, then at least we can get a sense of what is actually happening and what are the most important developments.
So what do we know now, right? A fair period of time into the Madlanga Commission of Inquiry that we didn't know prior. Because when you look at the words that have kind of become synonymous with Madlanga Commission of Inquiry, corruption, political interference, institutional failure, etc. But one could argue it's not like we didn't know that that existed before Mkonazi's revelations or even the Commission of Inquiry. Perhaps a counter-argument would be that, yes, the extent of it, the details of how it actually unfolded behind the scenes is what we didn't know, which we now know. But beyond that, I mean, has it been revealing in a sense that is actually beneficial?
I think so. I mean, look, there is a debate to be had about, whether or not people were actually paying attention to the 10 years of state capture under the former Zuma administration, which basically neutered many of our prosecutorial authorities and created a South African police services that was riven with factionalism. And I think there's two sides to this story. The one is the corruption and mismanagement and the relationships of officials with criminal syndicates or individuals. And in that case, I think we've had quite a bit of extra information. Kat Matlala's role and his testimony was clear. No, we really didn't know, as you said, the extent to which, how deep these relationships went. And, when you heard about whistleblowers being assassinated and people being taken out or, people being arrested, we always sort of thought, well, we had partial information. I think in some ways it's filled in some of those gaps. But the other side is the factionalism, the politics. So it's not just the corruption and the mismanagement and some of the criminal activities. It's the factionalism that I think this has been the other thing that has come very, very clearly with the Madlanga Commission, to see that the SAPS is at war with itself. And that, in fact, numerous politicians have also been sort of intervening in these factional battles and taking sides. And I think that is the other side of the story that has surfaced, and that we've, I think, become a bit of a clearer picture. It's not to say that the Madlanga Commission has told us things that, that already structurally and in the larger sense that we did not already know. But in order for prosecutions to take place, remember previous commissions, we had all this information, but nothing ever happened with those commissions. I think the difference is in the Madlanga Commission, we're beginning to see some actions take place. We're beginning to see some arrests. We're beginning to see some cases being made. And I think that is a positive thing, although it's still too early to say the extent to which this is going to be successful.
So, from a layman's perspective, right, you hear this sometimes in common social discourse, that, yeah, we had the Zondo Commission of Inquiry, revelations upon revelations, millions, if not billions of rand spent. And here, a couple of years down the line, we're having another commission of inquiry telling us a similar kind of story. Maybe different actors, different names, but a similar kind of story. So what do these revelations actually serve in terms of change, in the end of the day? It's a revelation, people get implicated, the debate continues after that the wheels of justice move very slowly, so people are still asking why those implicated in Zondo are not in prison uniforms. And the skepticism seems to be, at ground level anyway, that this thing will drag out, it will have its fair degree of news coverage, political careers may come to an end, certain factions within SAPS or within political parties and the political space may gain and others may lose. But in the end, does anything really change? How do we ensure that this particular process, can we ensure that it results in something different, more effective in terms of institutional reform?
No, Sulaimaan, we can't be guaranteed that that's going to happen because it is a commission of inquiry, as you mentioned. This is, it has certain powers and it can make use of those powers, even though previous commissions. But I'm sure we'll get to this in our conversation, but there's deeper questions, irrespective of what has come out and what might be done, about commissions themselves and how we deal with these problems. As you mentioned, these are structural, institutional, deep-seated problems that have been with us for the last 10, 15, 20, 25 years. This is nothing new, except the extent of it and some of the revelations around SAPS in particular. So the problem here, which I'm just going to jump to that, which is that the commissions are appointed by the president. Generally speaking, they're presidential commissions of inquiry. And as such, they are wrapped up in a particular political space which is already compromised, in which there are already conflicts of interest, in which we saw that with the Zondo Commission in particular. And even though the Madlanga Commission might seem a little bit more, how should we say, positive, or at least it seems more independently being run, we're still running into these same institutional barriers that prevent things, what gets revealed, from becoming being put into action. And I think this is where we have to really concentrate. So you're right. We could have 3 more commissions in the next 10 years, much more, information, what gets done. And the reason I would argue why we have such a slow process of actually activities emanating from these commissions, where people face consequences, where you can have a proper clean out of institutions that have been compromised, where you can have people not just put in jail, but new ways of doing things, new leadership, new capacity building, new skills, rescuing our state-owned and public institutions in many cases, is precisely because of the powers that exist for blocking those things and making sure that they just disappear. And also the criminal justice system itself, which is now beginning to be debated, which is an endless period of appeals, constant appeals. We saw the ex-president who's been appealing for 15 years in a court on charges that have been sitting there on the arms deal for how long? So I think if we're talking about institutional results, we need institutional reform. A commission is not going to give us institutional reform. It might give us some of the tools that we need, but the real answers to that institutional reform lie within the powers that are given to the president, the parliament, as well as the legislation that we need in terms of our criminal justice system. And I think we need to have some serious debates about changing some of those laws.
So talking about institutional reform, right, and trying to fix things after these revelations and these skeletons come out of the proverbial closet, I've seen certain analysts criticize what happened post previous revelations in terms of the formation of IDAC and the rise of Andrea Johnson. And what we see now in terms of the revelation of Madlanga is saying that in that quest, if you like, to try and change things, there was this misplaced or disproportionate optimism, and now see, we've got more of the same at best, if not worse, in terms of what has been revealed at Madlanga. So where are we going wrong, even in our endeavor to effect institutional reform?
Well, I think this is another good question. I think one of the reasons why we have this sort of blockage in institutional reforms is who gets to appoint whom, who has powers. So if you look at it, it's always an insider issue. It's always insiders. It's either the president, the cabinet, the minister, and have huge powers, basically, to appoint those that run our institutions, those that are responsible. Oftentimes, what happens is this involves friendships, patronage. It involves a process in which the public and other experts outside are not really involved. So, for example, if you remember, there was a huge debate at which many of those in civil society were involved in, when, for example, a new Inspector General of Intelligence, when our intelligence services and our state security was in a mess, the Inspector General that was going to be hired, and they were going to do that behind closed doors, and the minister was going to choose. And civil society said, absolutely not. We can't have this process again because it'll reproduce exactly the same problems. Let's have a public participation process. Let's have a real process. And that, I think, is where we need to start shifting, because if we continue to appoint people who, just because you know them or you went to school with them or they're in your political party or you like them or you think they're good, but you really haven't done the proper checks and they're not subject to public scrutiny, we're going to continue to have the same problems. So in that context, one of the real reforms that's needed is a much more participatory, democratic process of appointing those that lead our institutions, as opposed to making them political appointees of people in power.
So I think we kind of spoke a bit about what needs to happen at the top, right, in terms of effecting institutional reform. The other concern that both analysts and even common folk raise is that it would seem, from the outside at least, that the rot is quite deep. And we've heard this in the past, that even when the right people are appointed at the top, right? Take SAPS as an example. SAPS is not just, one entity that sits in one location. You can have a police minister that's very competent, that is well-intended. You can have a national police commissioner that's very competent or well-intended. But if the rot seeps right down to the bottom, to use the terminology of analysts that we speak to, obviously, and they say the infiltration. So previously we heard quite a bit about remnants of the Zuma era that are still part of the system. And using just that SAPS example, how do you then clean up when right down to ground level at every police station, at every region, you've got this rot that is quite embedded?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question to answer because there is no easy answer to that question. I mean, when the rot, and I agree, when the rot gets so deep, it's similar to using the metaphor of, a house that you don't maintain, and the pipes start breaking, the walls start peeling off, things start breaking. The more you don't maintain and repair it, the harder it is going to be to do so. And I think that's where we are right now. So there's no easy answer to this, but let's see where we can identify areas that could begin to start that process of improving. And I think the first thing is that we need to have a situation. Let's take SAPS as an example. It's clear there needs to be a clean out of SAPS, and there needs to be no apology. Yes, we have labor laws. Yes, we have procedures that need to be followed properly, but those that are there are simply defending their positions. We know whether or not they were directly involved in so and so and taking money or in facilitating it. They oversaw politically. They must take responsibility. We must end the culture of impunity. And I think this is the real issue. So politically, we have to, whether it's in SAPS or whether it's in ESCOM or whether it's in other entities, we have to make sure that those who break the law, if they're a constable who's taking a bribe at a very local police station or the national commissioner, it makes no difference. The law is the law. We have gotten to a point where our law is applied in a biased way. If you have political power, if you have money, well, you can pretty much get off. You can endlessly appeal. If you're at the bottom, you're basically out of luck in that context. So the institutional reform is not simply about just identifying the bad apples and getting them out, but it's about changing the procedures and making sure that we follow. We have a lot of good laws and a lot of good procedures. They simply aren't implemented. We can see in our own city of Johannesburg how this has played itself out with regards to service delivery, and we're in a massive crisis. So there's a multi-layered ways of going about this, but I would say that the only way that we're going to sustain those changes, which some are beginning to happen, is when the public gets involved. And I mean that in the public and civil society organizations, expertise, other people. So it's not simply left up to the political appointees and the political people who think that they can just call all the shots and do everything and then get away with it. So we need to deepen the democracy within SAPS. SAPS is not an entity, should not be an entity that is simply answerable to a police commissioner or a minister. It serves the public. That's its job. And therefore, the public has to be able to input into these things. So we need to find those mechanisms, whether it's at a local police station, in a local forum, or whether it's all the way at the top levels, where our democracy can be deepened so that we can have solutions to these problems that are across the board, that are not simply political appointees or political interventions. And I know that that's not a satisfactory answer to many people in the context of, well, we want to see something now. But I think we have to accept the fact that this repair job is going to take a long period of time. And if we're serious about it, we have to be serious about and I mean our as in ordinary citizens, our democratic potential and our democratic power, and not just always point the finger at the state or at the private sector and say, it's your problem, it's our problem, and we need to get more involved. When we do so, I think we can begin to sort these problems out.
On that point about you and I and ordinary South Africans getting more involved, we know that we are now coming closer to an election day by day. It's a local government elections. How does this election tie up with what we're seeing and what we've just been saying? Again, understandably, there's a degree of skepticism that whether I vote for A, B, or Y or Z, what really changes? You know, they all promise the right things. Their manifestos look brilliant. They're excellent at campaigning, each one saying they'll do better than the others. The incumbents saying they've learned their lessons and they've admitted to their mistakes and they're going to do better, but very little changes.
Yeah, look, I mean, this is the conundrum always with electoral politics, and I think it's not specific to our country. It's a global phenomenon, and so there's two or three points to make here. The one is that irrespective of our legitimate skepticism in relation to the electoral cycle, it is a democratic principle. Voting and representation is a democratic principle that we should all take seriously. Whether or not we believe that things are going to fundamentally shift or not is, I don't think, a real test that we should always put to ourselves. It's a question of whether or not we think, particularly at local government level, where the representatives are a bit closer to us and where we're electing ward councillors and so forth, whether we are serious about holding people accountable. It would just be the same as if you ran a business and you said, well, I'm going to be hands off. I really don't care. I've appointed somebody. They can come back and report to me in 5 years. Well, we wouldn't do that in a business because your business would go down. You certainly don't do the same in politics. So I think in some ways, what's happened is we've got a perfect storm where citizens, because of the lack of service delivery, because of the nature of our political class, which has been quite, how should we say, isolated, people have lost faith in the political system, and they're angry, and rightfully so. But we need to reclaim that. So it's about voting. One, go ahead and vote. Go ahead and register. Even if you spoil your ballot, or even if you choose somebody you don't think is going to get elected, it's an important process to engage in. Secondly, don't just leave it at that. Get involved in every single aspect that we can at local level to make sure that those that we do elect to represent us actually elect. So I don't know about in my area here. We're constantly onto our ward councillor. We're constantly meeting with our ward councillor. We're making demands. We're pushing him all the time. It's not that he can solve all our problems, but I can tell you with Joburg Water and City Power, we've gotten results as a result of our citizen activism here in my area where I live in Brixton, which has been a really badly affected area in Johannesburg. So we can have impact at local level if we get involved in that. And the third thing is to basically ensure that we are active citizens in collectivizing that power. In other words, going out and belonging to other civil society organizations and other initiatives, like, for example, what's happened with regards to the anti-migrant xenophobic violence, where thousands and thousands of foreign nationals have been left to their own device. And what have we seen? We've seen civil society organizations, relief agencies such as Ashraful Aid, Gift of the Givers, many others coming to the rescue. This is important. This is part of our democracy, and it makes a big difference. When politicians fail us, we can step in and take that gap.
Indeed. Well, we've run out of time, but thank you so much for your time and for chatting to us and for giving us a lot of food for thought and insightful perspective. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.
Have a great day and go well.
Thank you.
Well, that was political analyst Dr. Dale McKinley, and we were talking about the Madlanga Commission of Inquiry. Not going into the specifics of any one particular aspect of what has transpired. We didn't have enough time for that. But taking more of a broad overview and looking at the overarching issues. I think Dr. McKinley touched on one very key point, which I want to reiterate as a conclusion. Keep yourself adequately informed. Don't get caught up in the social media commentary, which is sensational. Don't look at it in a very one-dimensional manner. Identify who are the serious journalists who are giving you the kind of information that you need to have in order to be able to be adequately informed in terms of what is of relevance and importance and priority in as far as what is happening at the Madlanga Commission of Inquiry. We're going into an election season. We're going to be having many discussions in terms of how we need to approach it. But I think towards the end there, he also gave some key points about, despite the skepticism, what our approach needs to be. That's it for this week. Until next week, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.